Recording. All right, we are recording, and this is the Community Presbyterian Church Bible Study, number 15, I think, for this series. And we are looking at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And this picks up kind of in the same fashion. It's a little bit in the same vein of what we looked at last week. And if you recall, just the larger picture, again, always to make these connections, you have that story that runs from Genesis and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and the wilderness and the Exodus and the establishment of the tabernacle in the wilderness, the wandering in the wilderness and the entry over the Jordan into the new promised land, and the tribal dispersion and the unfaithfulness of some tribes, leading to the need for prophets and judges to align the people, to rally them together. And from those prophets, you have Samuel and the development of a monarchy, and first in Saul, and some of the dark times through his reign into David, and what seemed like a great time, sort of a rising of a leader up to that point where he starts to see his demise. And then you see God establishing his covenant with David, and then with Solomon, and now Solomon's the one to build the temple, but Solomon goes south, and then you have the split of the northern and the southern kingdom with Rehoboam, and in the midst of that, you have that tribalism that turns away from God, and that the bad kings in the north and the few good kings in the south. And then you have the Assyrians come and they scatter the north, and then the south is in exile. And that's kind of what leads us up to this period where the Babylonians have taken over, the Israelites are in exile. And last week we looked at these chronicles, and again, these books of the chronicles were sort of the retelling of that story I just gave you, but through the lens of do good and good things will happen, follow God, obedience, disobey, rebel, and bad things will happen. And there was, again, we talked about that catechetical nature of it, that teaching. And Karen, you sent me that text. And yeah, I think that the book is not just for, I think God can use the book, and I think God has used the book to be, in particular during a certain season through church history or through the history of Israel's faith, to use to form. I think it's an accessible way, but I think it's one that's curated, and I think that it's always curated. I think that when you go back to the idea that God inspires all of this, even in the and that's where I think the confession that God's spirit is even in the choosing of the books. We have to believe that God guides us and goes along this process. But I think there's always that moment where, and this is where faith comes in again, where you just have to say, well, humans are kind of screwy. So there's always could have been mistakes along the way, but that doesn't mean that God's word is untrue. And what we have in this is really a continuation of what we looked at last week. And it's been assumed that they were written by the same authors, and that they were originally all one whole thing. And in fact, it was originally called, wrong page here. It was originally called just Ezra. And there, there was some suspicion that maybe Ezra or someone that might have been the same author of Chronicles. But so there's a common connection to Chronicles in this book. And again, these books, and again, Ezra and Nehemiah were now in origin in the first few centuries of the church. And Jerome, when he translated the Bible into the Vulgate, both switched that to two different books and separated them. And I'll tell you, there's all sorts of scholastic debate over, which one came first. Was Nehemiah first and then Ezra? Was Ezra before Nehemiah? Were they contemporaries? In the midst of Nehemiah, in chapter 8, you see Ezra pop up, which throws everything out of sequence if you're trying to think of it in a chronological sequence. And the reason I keep going over this whole narrative and this whole story, and the fact that they went out and they were in Exodus and then they came back, and this again, what we're seeing at the end of last week of Chronicles, of Israel returning. This was at a time when they were trying to establish a people again. This is so important in particular because it deals with the tribalism and the unification of Israel, which also deals with the notion of where God is and God's presence and sense of presence. Also just deals with the idea that that they are reestablishing what it means to be a Jew. And there's a heavy reliance on this understanding, in particular in Ezra and Nehemiah, on the idea that there were promises that were made back to Abraham that are still waiting in some sense to come to fruition. And the whole time it's kind of like the Israels, between going over the promised land and having problems and then settling and then breaking apart and then however many years, 400 years of good and bad kings and people invading the land and intermingling of the marriages, and we're going to see that all, and then the diaspora and being exiled from Jerusalem. And again, we left Chronicles, and remember last week we said those two verses overlapped. We left Chronicles with this sort of statement from Cyrus saying that they can come up and they can return, and we'll begin when we look at the actual text to read those verses that overlap with Chronicles that give that sense of connection between the two. It actually, in the present day canon and the Hebrew canon, I guess it was eventually separated in the 15th century. So even in the Jewish and the Hebrew Bible, that it was separated. It was originally considered, again, to be part of Chronicles, but one of the things that they noticed the difference is that Chronicles has a strong retribution emphasis. That God will pay you back or allow bad things to happen to you if you don't, like there was a cause and effect that come into that, which do bleed into Ezra in terms of some of the mindset, or in Nehemiah maybe more so. There was also, and to be honest with you, I've read this in several places, and I haven't studied the books enough to really see it as much, but there are claims that Chronicles is more, or the Chronicles, or Chronicle as a book, is more hospitable to the Northern Kingdom. I don't necessarily know if I see that. I kind of feel like it just focuses. I feel like it's more positive by virtue of not being negative than it is positive about the Northern Kingdoms. But I think in terms of its emphasis, Chronicles tends to focus on those Southern kingdoms and their issues, so the Northern kingdoms don't look as bad. But there's also a lot of prophetic voices that drive Chronicles that we're not going to see in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, we'll just, these books together, if you think of them, we're going to think of them together, but we'll think of them in sort of three epics where you have, and none of them are very long. We have sort of Ezra 1 through 6, where it deals with, how do you say his name? Zerubbabel, who has the first movement of exiled Jews back to Jerusalem. And then we'll look at Ezra, and there's the sort of the second phase, perhaps, of Jews that go back to Israel. And this is where the chronology gets a little messy with Nehemiah. And then there's a third movement of Jews back to Israel, to Jerusalem, from exile. And so these two books chronicle these three movements. So 1 through sort of 6, you have Zerubbabel going back. Zerubbabel, by the way, means planted in Babylon. So he was a leader that was coming, who had never lived in the Promised Land, and he was commissioned by what's the guy's name? How do you say it? I wrote it down. Xerxes. It's one of Xerxes and the Xerxes line, but he was sent back, and it was during his reign, and so the first one was sent back to rebuild the sort of sacred worship space, and the second one was sent back, being Ezra, to sort of reform the people and bring some order in terms of how they worshipped and get a renewal to the covenant. And then we'll see Nehemiah come, and he reestablishes the walls. So we're going to see these two narratives. Nehemiah primarily deals with just in Nehemiah and what happens there, but we'll go through that narrative as well. There's all this debate whether when Ezra himself was sent back, and whether it was by Artaxerxes the first or the second, and they kind of there's lots of reasons to date it, and I guess part of those things are basically it's thought 58 years after the temple completion that Ezra was probably going back, and if that's the case, and Ezra preceded Nehemiah as sort of scribes or builders or renewers, reformers even, then it would have been during the first ruler, Artaxerxes I. And if Nehemiah actually came first and then Ezra came second, which we'll see in Nehemiah 8, you'll see this insertion of Ezra, then it's thought to come during the second. But the reality is we're talking about 100-year period, and it really doesn't make a difference. They weren't necessarily contemporaries, but there was thought that there was some overlap between them. In general, sort of think in terms of 450-ish to very late, or I guess early 400, like 398, 395 sort of thing. So again, in kind of a 50-year period, right around the 5th century BC. Again, as reminders, this is thought to be the same compiler as Chronicles, because there's a sophistication in the grammar and the syntax and the order, and there's a lot of borrowing from other books. Someone's here. And then Ezra himself, he wasn't quite a rabbi. He's called a scribe. He was a scribe. He was a Torah scholar. He's a teacher. He functions definitely more like some sort of Christian educator with a lot of authority. He wasn't quite a prophet because he wasn't prophesying anything. He wasn't a king in the same sense of a ruler or a leader, but he was someone who was a trusted from the Persian leadership that sent him back to go and restore the people in Israel. I read one thing, and I don't know if I quite 100% agree, and I don't know if I see it, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways, just for the sake of. But there has been, like, the idea behind these two books, or this whole book, is that it's meant to sort of begin with some hope. When you leave Chronicles, there's a sense of there's a new founding of people. But what this book does is it shows you sort of the foibles of even when God uses Cyrus to send back people and rebuild the temple and begin this process of restoring the Jews to Jerusalem, there's still just a sense of them not fully understanding what that means. And there's this horrible section where basically, I mean, we're going to see it in the second part of Ezra, where Ezra condemns the foreign marriages, and they send the wives and the children of these foreign marriages away. And it's kind of like, again, for those of us who have wrestled along this journey or this path of these Old Testament books, we're like, God doesn't seem very, but again, this isn't necessarily God. And I will make the argument that I think that actually the people were interpreting maybe not everything needs to be interpreted. Everything that happens in a certain context needs to be relived in another context. In other words, we'll come to that when looking at how God commanded the Israelites not to marry the Canaanites. God was sort of commanding them from, don't do this action, as opposed to, now that you're redefining you as a people, let's retributively punish others for the sake of your sins. The idea of sending away the wives and the children because they were intermingled, really when it's all middle, it was more about the identity than it was anything else. Okay, so that's kind of the broader overview. Is there, before we jump into sort of the three different sections, are there any thoughts or questions or connection points?
Yeah, I have a question. We've seen this before, but I kind of skimmed through these chapters today, and there are so many lists of names. I mean, just a whole chapter of names. Why were they so hung up? And they're all men's names, of course, and the women don't count. They, if they're foreign women and children, well, too bad for you. You're on your way. And why that strong emphasis always on recording all these names? What difference did it make what their names were?
Uh, my guess would be that it's tracing who was there. In particular, one of these things. I mean, like if you had a foreign wife and kids, and in this case, they probably thought, I want to purify myself, and I want it to be known that I was on this list of people who did this act. I think there is a sense of a census of reestablishing, and to be honest with you, when they were tracking the census, or they were or listing these things and writing them out, there probably was a sense of, we should record this in the same way we record our books for who members are and who's given what money and all. We have file folder of all this stuff that don't really make a difference. The difference is when you have ancient documents that point to the construction of a biblical or an ancient people, every single fragment that you have becomes important. And when you talk about the identity of the Israelite people, and again, we view scripture as the holiness, like everything in it has to be good for teaching. And that becomes our litmus test. If these names here don't seem to be good for any sort of direct application, why are they in there? It's a history book. It's a genealogical book. It's a book. This is where we as Christians are show a little too much, like we own the joint, because these are Israel's holy books that we have engrafted or used or chosen to be a part of our holy canon. We could have theoretically left them, at any time during history, in the first few centuries when they were deciding canonical books. They could have made the decision back then, and again, I think God was involved in it. They could have made the decision that these Hebrew scriptures, we'll use them as referential sort of books so that we understand where we came from, but we're really going to focus on just these books of the New Testament since Christ. I mean, I could have, and honestly, there probably were arguments throughout history for that very thing. Like, why are we including these Old Testament canon type books? But a fuller view of the redemption story says these books matter to Israel. So we have just taken largely their canon and said these were the books that we think contribute to our story as well.
I understand that the Jews still keep a record of their descent because they still believe that Christ will come again. And so that Mary, or the mother of Christ, will be a descendant of David. And so they still keep those detailed records of their ancestry.
And is it strictly the male line? Because you get the impression reading these books, only the men counted.
Well, pretty much, yeah.
And I mean, they couldn't help they were born women and children, but you don't count.
But and so my answer to that, Glenda, honestly, in a very direct way, would be if you look at the call, and again, it depends on how you want to view scripture. But if you look at the curse narrative of Eve, it says, "And your desire will be for the man, and he will rule over you." Yeah. And I think that we have to see a reversal of that, or the theoretical reversal of that in Christ, where we all become to Christ in equal footing. But prior to that, yeah, and even the effects of that still continue, obviously, after Christ. We can see that in our present day age. But yeah, I mean, I often do it to be funny, just in poke people a little bit. But if you look at the commandment for the Sabbath in Exodus 20, it lists everyone but the wife. I don't know if that was a mistake or if it was just but it says you shall have a Sabbath, and I'm sure you could argue that the you meant, an Israelite and his wife, but it says you and your sons and daughters and your male servants and your female servants and the male oxen and the female cattle, or whatever the names are, all, and your maid servants and your male servants. And it goes through all this male female stuff back and forth, but there's no mention of the wife. And again, adultery was not about a woman having sex with someone else's. It was about you having sex with another person's wife, but they're their property. In fact, all of those, do not covet your neighbor. It's all about your property. So it's, for better or for worse, it's part of the story and the narrative. And I often will say that we're just in a different time and place where we see life differently. But if that's the system, if you don't care about justice or some sense of equity, most people in power aren't going to relinquish their power so that others can take privilege or priority. That's just the way power works. So why would it be any different? So yes, exactly. In this time, they really were only counting the men.
And then Christ really turned that on its head, though. I mean, he associated with women, and in the New Testament, there's no male or female.
And rich and poor, and I mean, in all those things, and in law abiders versus, I mean, like that really, Christ was the divine reversal.
Right. And the foreigner and the alien within your gates and all of that became also a whole different approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
On lists of people, even today, our kids take their father's name. They don't have the mother's name.
Yeah.
So it still happens today. It's changing a little bit, but now the kids have to have 5 names behind their names.
Hyphenated.
And this is honestly, and the last thing I'll say about it is that's where rationality comes into play. Because if you live in a might and right world, men genetically are built to be bigger and stronger. And if you have a might and right world, then you will always have whoever has the most capacity to do to show physical force to be in power. It's only as we moved as a culture towards a more rational view of organizing civilizations that then it became, more of an your intelligence became more of a hallmark of leadership and power than your physical strength. Otherwise, wrestlers would be at the top of the food chain.
They're not.
We'd all have to ring around in leotards. Okay, what's that?
In my Bible, it says that Ezra was really legalistic and really set the tone for the Jewish religion from then on.
That's an interesting argument. I would say that he enforced a type of legalism, in particular around the marriage thing, which was pretty harsh. But if you actually look at the text, I would argue that it was the elders of the area. It was through Ezra's leadership, but the elders of the area pressed, and he felt compelled to do that. So it was he was the enforcer, and probably helped them interpret that. But I don't think it was a unilateral thing. But I think that sense, I think throughout, what it is probably that sense of strict legalism and obedience to the law came at some point because no one seemed to obey it. Like they just coming back to the same thing. And every generation, like generation after generation is failing. And again, Ezra and Nehemiah are no different. They fail all over the place. So maybe it just came to, but yes, there was, and again, the hard thing to imagine, and in my lifetime, I don't think I can imagine anything that has had that much of an identity change or shift. Maybe 9/11. So I'm trying, like there where you, and I think the coronavirus will be one of these shifting points. But it's kind of like, imagine if we all had to leave the country all of a sudden, and then we were gone for 70 years, and then generation, we're all living in different parts, and then we go back, and there's the last remnant that were there during the exodus of the country. Where do you start? Everyone is exposed to a different region, has been exposed to Babylonian or Assyrian and then Persian influence. You have all these different, and you have all these different gods, and you don't have really, and honestly, the covenant and all of the statutes and laws of God have never really been deeply established in anyone to the point where how do you actually build a people out of that? It almost feels like probably like you're starting from scratch. So there were things that were held on to, but even on all your sacred relics, as we'll see, that they were returned to the temple as Jerusalem was being built. But without those, who were they? This is why going back to the temple and the reestablishment of it, and really Cyrus is like, or Cyrus is like a, that's why he's looked at as the anointed one. And like you said, Jim, last week, it wasn't just the Jews. I think he was kind of agnostic and an ancient pluralist that said all of it is good, and very clearly taking the riches that he had and saying, everyone needs to reestablish, because if they do, then we have a peaceable kingdom. he had a different mindset of ruling. If I have people who are in peace and can worship the gods in their own regions, then, you know, he probably was like, well, then you can tax them a little along the way and everyone benefits from it. But he didn't want turmoil everywhere. So he conquered those he had to conquer, and then he set out to reestablish. And again, it wasn't just the Jews. It was recorded through other regions as well, through other religions. And I actually thought, and I read, I think I recall that that one of these leaders was very connected to Zoroastrianism, which is one of those earlier religions that actually has a lot of commonality with Judaism as well. I mean, most religions have. I was saying that to someone here. You know, he said Donnie, our local Buddhist here. And I said, you know, when you take Gandhi, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, all of these folks, they all preach a similar message: peace, love your neighbor, be kind to others. Like, you know, at the end of every religious expression, there is the same. Now, we just believe that it comes through Christ as opposed to, you know, human assent. But okay, you want to go through this? We've done more in less time, just so you know. It feels like a lot, but it's not. And we'll look at it through kind of three things, and so we'll talk about Zerubbabel and what was happening in these first few chapters, and then we'll look at Ezra, and then we'll look at Nehemiah. So jumping in right at the beginning to Ezra 1:1, and in 1:2, and again, if you go back to, this is where that link point, if you go back to Chronicles, the last two verses again say, thus say the king, says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. And again, for them, the region they were in, as far as they could see, he had everything that they knew about. And he charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah, again, that southern kingdom. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And that's where it stops. And then we flip over and we start in Ezra. And we see in Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, thus says the king Cyrus of Persia, the Lord and God of heavens has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem and Judah, and all those among you who are his people, may the God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, and he is the God who is with Jerusalem, and going on. And so then you have this beginning, and really this signifies the end of this Babylonian captivity, or being in exile in Babylon, and you see the beginning of this movement back. And what's interesting is, and you see even in that first verse, it says in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished. And I point that out to say that from now forward, like, I hope you all have a general sense of the time frame, and that's why I keep going back over of what's happened from the beginning of the Bible until now, because some of the prophets that we're going to look at, in particular, when we get past Psalm and Proverb and some of these wisdom books, we're going to jump into some of these prophets, and the prophets that we look at actually happened in the midst of those 400 years of the northern and the southern split, where you had bad kings in the north and some good kings in the south, and mostly bad kings. But you're going to have that sense, and so again, I'm going to try to frame it in the now you have some hooks of the chronology of it that we can put these. So even in that first chapter, you see what's happening now in terms of Cyrus sending back Jews is part of the prophecy that was happening in Jeremiah. And I think I was looking at today. And it's in Jeremiah 25. It says the Babylonian captivity was foretold. And so Jeremiah would have happened prior to this, but the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah of Judah. And it was the 1st year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Again, which the prophet Jeremiah spoke to all people of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And it goes on to basically say that they're going to go into exile, and I'll bring upon the land and the words I've uttered against it and everything written in the book, which Jeremiah prophesied. For many nations and great kings will make slaves of them. And so he goes on, and there's this sense of this doom that's going to happen, and we're seeing the bit of that what just happened in terms of that exile. And so the return of the Babylonian exile was something that was prophesied by earlier prophets, and we're starting to see the fruition of that. Again, so what you have kind of in the story is Zerubbabel, which means planted in Babylon. He was there. He was, you see him sort of come up, and he is called there to rebuild the temple. And you see those who returned with him in chapter 2 of Ezra. And again, this is one of those lists, but you know what, that if that's your people and your tribe, you want it to be on the record that you were one of those first that returned. You were on the first ship back. And not really ship, caravan, I guess, but there was a sense of definitely them offering and them going. And then in chapter 3, you have the beginning of really the restoration. The 7th month came, and the Israelites were in towns, and people gathered. And there was this sort of, in chapter 3, you have this, you have the first year of their return from the exile, and Zerubbabel has established is planning on reestablishing the temple, but you have the spot where the temple was, and there was like nonstop burnt offerings in chapter 3. They're just coming and going and going and going, because it was kind of like they were returned, and they didn't really know exactly what they were doing. They were just trying to return to this sense of worship. And then in 3:8, you have the beginning of the second year where Zerubbabel is laying down the foundation. And you see in 3:10, it says, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with the trumpets, and the Levites and the son of Asaph and the cymbals, according to the directions of King David. And so there was this initial desire to let's reestablish what we knew. In chapter 4, you see a resistance movement that surfaces, and I think this is really fascinating, actually. And you see this sort of, and in the midst of this, one of the things I noted was in these first 6 chapters, you have the temple vessels returned. You have the altar and temple resurrected in their former places. You have this, and you have a series of celebrations, both in terms of the celebration of the temple and of Passover that will happen. So right at the beginning of the return from these exiled Jews, they're coming back and they're reestablishing the very first thing, which is the worship. But what's interesting in that is the builders laid this foundation, and there's this celebration, like we've arrived, we've done it. But then in a few verses later in chapter 3, he says in 12, but many of the priests and Levites and heads of the families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, meaning those who remembered who that when the temple was there, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house. Though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish between the sounds of joyful shouts from the sounds of people's weeping, for the people shouted so loudly that the sounds were heard far away. There was this sense of, this isn't what was supposed to be. We've returned, but what we returned to is Jerusalem was in rubble. The wall was broken down. The temple walls were not there. They're worshiping at the spot where it was. And people were excited to be back, but those who remembered the grandeur of the temple that was there, that actually made, and that God dwelled. And you had this vision of when the temple was built by Solomon, and the cloud came down and embodied this building. There was a majesty and an embodiment there, and this was not that. This was broken Israel trying to figure out how to be a people again through the little worship practices they knew. In chapter 4, you see, and you will see this pattern of renewal and resistance. And maybe then, and some commentators suggest that then even a paradoxical or a ironic ending to some of the resistance that is shown to rebuilding the temple. But in 4, you see the resistance of building the temple, and it says, where was it? When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were rebuilding the temple of the Lord, they approached them. They approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the family and said, let us build with you, for we will worship. And there's thought, and I read both of these, and I don't really know which to go. I'm kind of going, I guess I kind of lean one way. There's thought that these were Jews. These were the grandchildren of the intermingled Jews that remained in Jerusalem during the Babylonian exile, because they were connected to non-Jewish sects within Jerusalem. And then there are those who feel that they were nothing to do with the line of Jews, and that they were just the people who were left, and who remembered embodying this and were saying, hey, this is, part of the, and we're like, hey, we don't want to be left out of this too. But Zerubbabel's response to them is, no way. Like, no, like, we're the remnant, you are not. And there was a rejection of it that says, you're not going to help us build. And so this is the first, so there's resistance. And so they kind of say, no thanks, but no thanks, but they're really not the initial thanks, just the no thanks. And there's this conflict, and this conflict's interesting because it will come back again. So you have this beginning of the process of restoration of the temple, and that comes in 5. And then what's interesting, it says in 5, chapter 3, at the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the province, and this is like this feels like a Monty Python skit, because it's like every single time they list this dude, they got a list of where he's from and all. This Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river at Sheathwarbuz, Enai and their associates came to spoke to them, and every single time it has to go through that big list of these hard names to pronounce, and it keeps coming up again. And I was like, what is this deal here? But they doubt him. They're like, what are you rebuilding the temple for? So you got to imagine, you're a remnant of some sort. You lived in Jerusalem. The Babylonians get conquered by the Persians. King Cyrus is sending, I'm going to send back this big mass of people who were Jews who used to live there. This was their home. They're going back. They haven't been there for 70 plus years. They don't know what they're going back to. It's a destroyed city. There are people still inhabiting it. They go back and they're commissioned by this king to rebuild the temple. And now they have people who are living there like, what are you doing? Like, all of a sudden you all show up and you're just going to start rebuilding this thing? Well, we want to help you. Maybe and we don't really know their motives, but they don't trust them. So they send a letter to Darius, who was again a leader in the area. I'm not sure exactly what connection he had to Cyrus in general, or Cyrus in general, but they send a letter to Darius. He was clearly Darius the king, probably of a region, that region, and wanted to know. And so they say, what's going on? Why are these people doing this? And then Darius sends back a letter, and they go and they search in some scroll, and they see that King Xerxes, or that Cyrus sent them back to rebuild the temple. And so he sends a letter back basically saying, leave them alone. They have the king's blessings. They sent a caravan with them. They sent the silver and gold. And then Darius actually said, furthermore, I decree that if anyone alters this edict and like tries to change, and you see this in 6:11, and I just, I can't help pull these things out because I think they're funny. It says, furthermore, I decree that if anyone alters this edict again so that they can rebuild the temple, a beam shall be pulled out of the house of the perpetrator, who then shall be impaled upon it, and the house shall be made a dunghill. So if you oppose the edict, they're going to take a beam out of your house, impale you on it, and then use your property as a waste pool for human waste. That's essentially what was going to happen. So again, you see this sense of and then they celebrate the completion of the temple. They dedicate it, and they have a Passover, and the festivals are celebrated because they've done this great thing. So that's kind of the end. So at the end of this first 7 chapters, you have the reestablishment of the altar and the tabernacle, not in its final form, but in a worshipful, usable form. You have an opposition from the locals. You have a letter from King Darius to reinforce King Cyrus's edict that this was meant to happen. And then you have 7, which brings on the coming and the entrance of Ezra, the writer of the book. So let's stop there and see if you have any questions.
I just have a comment. As I'm reading this, I see they're referred to as Jews. And once in a while, they were referred to as Israel. But is this kind of the first time that they start calling them Jews? And does that go back to the tribe of Judah, that mostly they came from the tribe of Judah? Because now, we always called them Jews, but now since Israel has become a nation, we call them Israelites. But now you start to see them called Jews. And
I think
I'm just wondering,
self-
is this the first time? Have they been called Jews up to this point?
No, I think you see it back in the Exodus, and I think it's more just the Israel. So it's kind of like a national identity versus an ethnicity, or even an ethnicity defined. Jews would be Israel's a nation or a people, but I think Jews also a nation of people, but established through, and maybe more referentially through the idea of a religious or spiritual or covenantal association.
All right, but
And
it
that's what's that?
does seem like it has something to do with the tribe of Judah.
Well, they sound the same, but I don't necessarily know if I'd have to look up the etymology of the word. I'm sure, but I don't think Judah is spelled very differently than Jewish would be used. But no, that's a good question.
Yeah, I just was curious. Yeah.
I mean, most people use them interchangeably. These days, we actually distinguish between ancient Israel and modern day Israel, because not necessarily modern Israel doesn't necessarily jive with everything that ancient Israel did and as a nation too. So
It seems like a recurring theme in these books has something to do with purity. That they had to maintain their ethnic purity. They couldn't intermarry. They had to follow the worship of their past, and they couldn't have the false gods, the idols. It seemed like the whole emphasis here was really on maintaining their identity, their purity.
I think in this case, reestablishing that, and you're going to see that in full force here in this next section as Ezra comes on, because as much as Ezra had a book named after him, the thing that we leave with the last image of him was not only a restoration of the Torah and the covenant and the establishment of an identity of a people, but also in a somewhat ethnic cleansing, which in modern day times could be looked back at as not quite a genocide because you're not killing them, but definitely a breaking of what, that would be a hard thing to do today. Okay, so you have a jump at the end of chapter. Really, this is about 60 years after you have sort of Ezra coming on the scene, and so again, Israelites established, the temple's rebuilt, and now Ezra's coming on, and he was a scribe, described as a scribe, and he sort of has this special task to round up Israel and to get them a little bit more in line with what we understand the Jewish identity to be. You have that. You have some dating there in the first few verses, some in 7:7. Some of the people and some of the priests and Levites and singers and gatekeepers and temples also went to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. And again, that's that sense of timing, and they're trying to place it. And that's one of the things that actually was noticed by some commentators that you'll see throughout Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. You'll see these little time markers. In other words, he was trying to establish some sense of time, but then there's this whole critique narrative around some of the mixing up of some of these times in terms of how they fit. And again, this chronologically in the Bible, again, when we hit Psalms, we're going back to David. When we hit Proverbs, we're going to Solomon. We're going to kind of end the end of the story where they go into sort of reestablishment of Israel, and then we're going to go back and we're going to fill in some of the gaps of our story. But then you have at the end in 7:10 and 11, you have for Ezra had set his heart on the study of the law of the Lord, and to do it each time the statutes and ordinance in Israel. So he was being sent by God to Jerusalem from exile to and what I loved, and this goes back to the letter thing, in 11, mine is titled "The Letters from Artaxerxes to Ezra," And the first time they went out, when I can't ever say it, and Zerubbabel went in, he didn't have a letter. Then they got in trouble and they had to send for a letter. Well, apparently they learned from that mistake, because both Ezra and Nehemiah travel with a letter. And there's a point that they both have a letter with them. So they were kind of like, you know what, I'm going to bring some authority with me. And every single time each of them went, the king sent all sorts of riches and guards and protection. And so there was just a sense of mission of going back to reestablish. So you have in chapter 7, you have a letter that comes around. And then you have in 7:25, I thought this was interesting. And it says, in God talking to Ezra, and you, Ezra, according to the God-given wisdom you possess, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, who know the laws your God, and you shall teach those who do not know them. So that was his task. And all who will not obey the law of your Lord and the law of the king, let the judgment be strictly executed on them, whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of their goods and for imprisonment. So in other words, Ezra's being sent back and saying, get people in line. And if they don't fall in line with the laws of Moses and the sense of reestablishment of the people those are the things that they're going to be, death, banishment, confiscation of all your goods, and imprisonment. So I think that's worth noting, is that's kind of scary and that's kind of forceful and it's kind of being pushed. And it was kind of one of those things that you'll see as this goes on. They're forced to gather to figure out what's happening, in this sort of purity emphasis. So Ezra feels like he's got this sort of commissioning that he has to go through. You see again in 27 chapter, or in verse 27 of 7, they sort of praise Cyrus and Darius for putting these, and that God has used them. In 8, you have a parallel to 2, where they're again describing who all went on the journey. And the servants in 8:15, the servants of the temple, there's prayers for protection, what they brought for gifts to the temple. There's even a prayer as they're getting ready to leave for the journey, that they would be delivered from the enemy and ambush, and they were delivered from enemies and ambushed along the way. So again, you're imagining them come back from exile, and that there obviously were ambushes happening, and then God delivered them from that. And so they're coming back, and Ezra has established the sense of who they are. And then in chapter 9, it gets kind of ugly. And when Ezra and 9, just when Ezra he learns that there were mixed marriages, and it says, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands of their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and going on, and just pointing out that there's this sense of they did exactly what they were not supposed to, which was marry outside of Judaism. And then you find Ezra weeping for this, and then you have this prayer where Ezra repents on behalf of Israel. And in verse 10 of 9, it says, and now, our God, what should we say after this? That we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophet, for saying, the land which you are entering to possess, the land which is unclean, with the populations of the people of the lands and their abominations. And again, remember, going back to the story, this is when they were going over to the Jordan, and the Canaanites were there, and the Canaanites were sacrificing babies, and so there was a sense of don't intermingle. So the question is raised by commentators and scholars was that, God was saying, don't go into that land and marry. Well, they've already, and that already happened, but now in a very pronounced way, as they were out in exile over 70 years plus period, and they were now had married, and many had children, and they were coming back, and there's a sense of they did what they weren't supposed to, that was commanded of them when they were crossing the Jordan and into the promised land. Chapter 10 is where you have that sense, and this goes back to what Jim mentioned earlier. Ezra prayed and made confessions, and it said, throwing himself down in the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, and the people also wept bitterly. So there's a deep sense of remorse. And then the elders came and said, we have broken the faith with our God and have married foreign women from the people of the land. And even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. And so let us now make a covenant with God to send away those wives and their children according to the counsel of my Lord, and those who tremble at the commandments of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. Then Ezra stood up and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all of Israel swear that they would do as been said. So Ezra is really more, he's saddened by it and he repents for it, but it's the people's response that he enforces. And I'm not saying he didn't agree with it, but I don't want to pin all of that just on Ezra as a character. I do think that the text points to the fact that he was leading in that, but that necessarily wasn't necessarily him. They do refer to him in 10:10, just a note, as a priest, although most of the time they refer to him as a scribe. But then you have, and so what happens is in 10, they call people out, and then they give them 3 days to make it into this great assembly. And it's raining and people are trembling, and they basically say, we're going to cleanse ourselves of this, of all foreigners. And then there's a list in the very end of the chapter that lists all of the names of the people who sent their wives and children away. So the question becomes, what is more important? God had already spoke about that not divorcing at this point, and then divorce was already an issue. So then the question that I read again and again was, what's more important, ethnic purity or God's commandment not to get a divorce? So,
obviously.
well, in this case, yeah, ethnic purity. And again, what did that even mean? And here's the thing that I would say is just because something, as much as I confess in a very Calvinistic sense that God ordains all things in this world, I have a way to rationalize that. I do think that people have human agency. And I think that sometimes the scriptures don't necessarily record everything that was supposed to happen. They record things that did happen. So just because a people determined that this was an act that needed to happen, doesn't necessarily mean that it was God saying, send them all away. Now, in this case, it could have been. I'm not saying it's also not that God was sending them away. I'm just saying that the presumption that everything happens, that everything the Israelites do, that everything the new Christians do, doesn't necessarily mean that God wants those things to happen. Sometimes those things just are allowed to happen, and God deals with the consequences of them.
Why couldn't they convert?
And I don't know if you really, in the same way, I guess it's true, because the Israelites are accused of, incorporating the views of other tribes into their own religious beliefs. But all right,
It seemed like a kind of pragmatic solution, because of what they said here. So they feel like, okay, we've sinned. We shouldn't have married these women. And so then they say in the end of chapter 10, what is that, about verse 14? Let everyone who has sinned in this way meet here at a certain time with the leaders and judges from our towns. And if we take care of this problem, God will surely stop being so terribly angry with us. We get rid of these wives and maybe God will bless us. It was almost like manipulating God's reaction to them or something.
well, and I kind of love that you said that, Glenda, because you see, there will be, as we look at Nehemiah, and again, Nehemiah, although it was written by Ezra, Nehemiah was a distinct, separate person who came and did several things. But there is this subtle theme running through Nehemiah, and we'll see it in 5:19, we'll see it in 13:14 and 13:22 and 13:31, where Nehemiah is saying to God, remember the good things that I'm doing, God.
Yeah.
There's this bargaining, like, hey, I've done a really great job here, God. Don't forget that I did a good job. Like, I want to remember by this. So in that same sense, again, there's a cause and effect, but that's the relationship they had. So when we get into the New Testament, we encounter this notion of grace. It's not surprising that it's a hard pill or something hard to grasp by Israelites, because for so long, this sort of cause and effect, retribution, obedient, disobedient narrative is what defined their relationship with God.
Yeah.
Okay. We got 5 minutes. I'm going to plow through Nehemiah. We can do it. It's sort of a narrative book. I'll just give it to you and then we can talk about it at the end. We don't have to end right on time, but Nehemiah was originally called the Nehemiah Memoirs, or that's what it was thought to have been referred to as. It's written mostly in a first person narrative, which differs from Ezra and Chronicles, where you have stints where Ezra was jumping in, but otherwise there are often places where it's referring to someone in third person. In general, what Nehemiah was sent to do, now keep in mind, now you have an established people, they've got rid of their wives, you have the temple, it's already, worship's back up and running. But Nehemiah has this realization that Israel's back there and their walls are broken down, and is concerned for their safety as a nation and as a people. So whatever his name is, Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah with a letter. Keep in mind, with a letter, and to deal with it. And so what you have here is you have Nehemiah going to rebuild the wall. The text lends towards ideas that he's going to really sort of help Israel get built. He ends up instituting justice and some religious observances, and really just sort of brings and reinforces that sense of staying away from foreign marriages or crisscrossing with other tribes. He's there to kind of that third phase of reestablishing Israel back into Jerusalem. When he learns of the walls, he actually asks Artaxerxes to send him. He says, please send me. And so he's sent with protection, he's sent with gold and silver and supplies and all of this. And then he goes around and actually, as we get into it, so Nehemiah prays for his people. Nehemiah is sent to Judah in chapter 2. In the second part of chapter 2, you have Nehemiah who basically, and it's really interesting. In chapter 2:13, it says, I went out by night to the valley gate, past the dragon's spring and the dung gate. I love that it says the dragon's spring. Like, that's just sort of like that, who would have thought they would have such a cool name for a spring back then, not like Spring of Jacob or something, the Dragon Spring. Hey, where are you going? I'll meet you over at the Dragon Spring. That made me smile. Anyway, he circles the whole thing to check out where it's compromised. And it's just, you read it and it sounds like it's just in rubble. There's all sorts of broken spots where you can enter in. And again, remember, walls of Jerusalem were not just walls and then it was just a wall. It was a wall and then a property built within that. Kind of going back to Rahab, they went up, and the reason they were able to escape the wall is because someone's house was right up against the actual outside wall. In other words, they put a wall up and they built houses, and so you would have had a really thick thing that would have had inhabitants living in it. So he circles the whole thing and looks at it and checks out what's going, and he does it in secret, so no one knows. And then he makes the decision to build the walls, and he talks to the elders. And immediately he gets oppositions from the same folks who gave Zerubbabel a opposition in terms of rebuilding the temple. And he kind of rejects them as well and says, no thanks. And now they're mad. They're like, this, this is, you've rejected our help up to this point. So there's, in chapter 4, you see a hostile plot that is sort of a rebellion forming. And these locals are like, well, we're going to take it down. And he gets wind of that. Nehemiah does, and he basically puts half the people, and again dealing with the men, he took half of his men and he put them out as soldiers, and they protected it, and no one was allowed outside the temple at night or Jerusalem. They all had to be within the bounds of the walls. And then he had half the people building, and even the builders, it said, had swords with them. So there was this sense of just, we got to build the wall, we're going to get attacked. And then in 5, so he deals with that, and that kind of dies down. And then you see the first time you see Nehemiah looking for some credit in 5:19, it says, remember for my good, O God, all that I have done for this people. So he's like, hey, God, remember me. And then you get into chapter 6, and it says, and it starts with, now there was reported that this wall had been built and there was no gap left. And it said, come, let us meet together in one of the villages, but they intended to do me harm. And so there was a sense of these locals were trying to get Nehemiah to come meet because they were going to hurt him. And he was like, no, that's not going to happen. You're not going to hurt me in it. You're not going to hurt me. And there was an accusation that he was basically throughout this. You see in chapter 6 they were accusing him of some stuff, and then again at the end. And here's what's interesting. Now you have Nehemiah saying in 6:14, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, according to those things that they did. So also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." So on the opposite of saying, "Hey, remember me," he's also saying, "God, remember the things they did too." So there's this theme of like Nehemiah is like keeping tabs on what's going on. So you have the walls completed in 6. And then you have a list of the exiles again in similar fashion as you had in Ezra, of the 2 times of those who came back, and then you have a party that's happening in the midst of those chapters, of the celebration of the wall and who's all there, and it's sort of like that census recounting, and then you have this strange entrance of Ezra in chapter 8, and this is what throws historians, and really honestly there's no consensus. There's people who argue one way and people who argue the other, and you have Ezra entering on the scene. Whether or not he was a contemporary, we don't know. Some say that this chapter 8 of Ezra or of Nehemiah really should have gone between chapter 8 and 9 of the actual book of Ezra, that it was just out of order. But basically what happened is you have these festivities. And they said, "Oh, we were supposed to celebrate in booths." So there was this emphasis of celebrating for 7 days of all that was happening. And in 9, you see this national confession of who they were. And again, like many things in the Chronicles, as we saw earlier, there's this retelling of the story of Israel, and you see that all through 9. 9:9. You can, my eyes got Red Sea and Egypt and manna, and you have this mention of all of this sort of journey, reiterating again for the formation of the people what happened. It's so important that they understand where they came from. There's a dedication of the wall in 12:5 as the population increases, and you have temporal responsibilities established, and then so it seems like everything is going well. They got the altar back. They got the law established. They got rid of all the people in the foreign marriages. Now they have the walls built. Like Israel seems like they're coming into their own and having a sense of who they are. And then you have Nehemiah come in, and you have this sense of in Nehemiah of this in the last chapter of a call to reform. And there's a reminder that there was a separation of foreigners. Nehemiah calls again for reform in the temple and a tighter and stricter adherence to temple regulations and how they worship. There was a call to return back to Sabbath, even to the extent that they wanted people to shut the gates because people had established market booths outside the gate, and they wanted them to stop. They were trying to control this sort of work on the Sabbath. And then eventually, again, reiterating the marriage purity to finish out the book. And you have, again, in that last chapter, in the 14, you have, "Remember me, O God, concerning this, so not to wipe out my good deeds that I have done for my house of God, for the house of my God and for his services." Again in 22, "And I command the Levites they should purify themselves. Remember also in my favor, God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." And then finally ending the book in the very last line, "Remember me, O God, remember me, O my God, for good." And you have this sort of, again, self-seeking story of this guy who's like trying to make sure he's in good with God. So through the whole thing, you have this idea, really, again, that Israel is coming into its own. You got to go see it, Jordan.
You gotta go.
You have this, Israel's coming into an end and coming to its own. And then you see again, right before the end of the story, that there's still problems in the temple. There's problems with keeping Sabbath, and there's problems and that they're trying to resolve around marriage. So it doesn't end on the greatest of note, but if you follow the story this long and you just have seen God redeem Israel, it leaves you on a note that says, what is next? I don't want to, you can't end with just the failure of Israel. You want to end with seeing God redeem them and once again restoring them as a people. Now, the jump to Esther doesn't necessarily, and we'll look at the time frame of that next week, but it doesn't necessarily jive with the end of this story, in terms of what was happening. And again, in Esther's kind of a little vignette of its own. but you don't leave as Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah feeling super great about what was happening. All right, that's it. Question?
I got one quick question.
Yeah,
You said they finished that wall in 52 days. How much wall are you talking about?
it was already up. I mean, it wasn't as if the whole wall was destroyed. And actually, if you go through the narrative, it shows you the different basically they called upon people to fill sections. If you look at where was it? Like let me go back here. I think is it 10? There's a whole bunch of somewhere, I don't remember the exact, somewhere when the wall's completed, they're listing the people who were there. Somewhere in the midst of Nehemiah, it says, and this person rebuilt their wall, and then they were the people who were living in the houses adjacent to the wall. And so, and if you read the account of Nehemiah going around the wall and checking it out at night, and then you couple that with the account of people repairing their own dwelling places, I think there was a sense of fortifying the wall. And my guess is not in the sense of it looked like a perfect wall everywhere, but in the sense of some places there probably was tumbling down before it, and there were burnt. Some of them were burnt. They mentioned burnt stone, and they were hewn, and so everyone took a part in rebuilding this sort of structure, and where there were holes and gaps, and they guarded those holes and gaps. And it even says at one point, I loved it, in chapter 6, it says, "I built the wall there, but there were no gaps left, though. At the time, I had not set up the doors and the gates." So it's like he had to confess, for the records, the walls were up, but I hadn't had time to get to the gates. So there's a sense of this ongoing process of what it means to protect. And I think one of the things that actually one of the commentators said that was interesting, and I didn't really see it as much, but when you think about some of the other visions that the prophets, and if we had done it in chronological order, perhaps we might see this, but some of the visions that the prophets prophesied about what Israel would be when it was reestablished weren't happening here, because they're building walls, they're kicking foreigners out, they don't want other nations around. And what other prophets, in particular Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah, testified to was all nations worshiping God, where there would be no fear of invasion. And so you have this sort of tension at the end that says this is not quite the vision that if we had seen and walked through the whole narrative over the last few gap of centuries, that the prophets necessarily prophesied. But I would say this is the first step. This is the human attempt of Israel to try to establish themselves the best they understand as God's people, and very well maybe where some of that legalism comes from as they reestablish themselves. All right,
Jason, real quick, in my Bible, the Catholic one, the next book is the book of Tobit. And then after that, the book of Judah.
we don't have that. We do. I think they're in our, which books are there?
Tobit? I
Tobit
thought it
is
was
the
the
first.
Hobbit first, but
Judith. Tobit and Judith.
Tobit, the book of Tobit, Tobit,
Yeah.
and the book of Judah.
Yeah. And in my Bible, those are the first books of the Apocrypha. So they just were removed, and without actually looking at the particular book. And we can do that. I mean, I would love to actually.
I'm just curious.
No. Well, I would like to go. We're going to do we'll do the Apocryphal books at the end.
Okay.
And see where they fit, and maybe look at why they were extracted or what the rationale was for their extraction. So in my Bible, again, they're represented, but only in the Apocrypha section.
Okay.
But again, we kind of lose a lot of chronological sequencing at this point. So that's the important thing. That's why we've emphasized again the story. If you have some of that, if you have in your mindset the movement of Israel and what was happening as God was trying to establish this people in this land, it just never seems to work out. If you have that understanding, when we go back and we look at some of these kings, we'll get a little bit closer look at what was happening, and we can actually see what the prophets were prophesying against. And so it's kind of like we've gone through the big narrative now, And then at the end of it with Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, we're going through like kind of like the summary of the end, you know, the whole story again, and sort of and we're beginning a new chapter. Like what happened to these people? But now we're going to go back and we're going to look at some of the other over the next. I mean, again, Psalm and Proverbs and some of these wisdom books and things were written prior. Some of them will still come in advance, but at least you have some place and framework to place them in. All right.
Okay,
Does that work?
next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, we'll jump into Esther.